Hello again, Governor of Ohio, Mr. Mike Dewine. To reintroduce myself to you and all new viewers of this channel, my name is David Roush. I am a friend of an innocent man who is on death row in your state, Mr. Keith LaMar. Today is February 12th, 2026. In 48 weeks, the state of Ohio plans to execute Keith for crimes he did not commit. I am going to send an open letter to you every week until January 13th, 2027, urging you to grant Keith full clemency and set him free. I will also read these letters to you on weekly episodes of this YouTube channel in the hope that the American public knows about Keith and joins the cause for his liberation. I encourage people of conscience in America and throughout the world to join in Keith's cause and urge you to do the right thing. Set Keith LaMar free. In my first 4 letters to you, I presented my overview of Condemned, Keith's autobiographical account of his 30 years of incarceration in Ohio prisons. He has spent 20 years on death row and even more in solitary confinement. Keith's book is a story of harrowing injustice, survival, and transcendent compassion. I wholeheartedly encourage you to read it. Its power as a piece of writing is extraordinary, but most importantly, it is an extremely compelling testament to his innocence and to the brutal, unjustifiable torture he has suffered as an inmate. Keith's innocence has a direct and obvious implication to you and to your responsibility as a public servant. If my overview is not enough to compel you, please read the book. My 5th letter to you, Governor Dewine, is a description of another achievement of Keith's grand soul, namely his work as a musician in a jazz band called the Freedom First Ensemble. In addition, I will describe how I first learned of Keith and how I came to know him personally in my 5 in-person visits with him at the Ohio State Penitentiary in Youngstown. It is my account of the wonderful, precious man that I know Keith to be. I want to tell you about this to summon your human compassion and moral courage. To put this discussion in context and to familiarize new viewers of this channel with Keith's book Condemned, however, I will summarize the narrative and primary themes of the book. Though Keith was originally incarcerated for an act of self-defense he committed in 1989 at 19 years old, he would not be given a death sentence until 1995. The Lucasville prison riot in 1993 and what followed are the most fateful events of his story. On April 11th of 1993, a group of Muslim inmates revolted against the prison in protest of a tuberculosis test that the prison had tried to force them to take. In the ensuing chaos, 8 prisoners and 1 guard were killed. Keith had been in the prison yard exercising when the revolt began and had no stake in their cause whatsoever. He went back into the prison to try to collect his belongings from his cell, but returned to the yard shortly thereafter to avoid the chaos. The National Guard and the Ohio State Highway Patrol sent heavily armed guards into the prison that evening to quell the revolt. They used cruel and unusual punishment to re-establish order. They stripped the prisoners naked and put them in groups of 10 in cells for 1. In that incredibly stressful circumstance, Keith witnessed the killing of one of his fellow inmates by 3 others. All of the inmates were denied adequate food and water, the ability to clean themselves, and access to legal counsel in this torturous circumstance for 9 days. After they were finally moved to normal cells, Keith and other inmates began decades of solitary confinement under strict administrative control. For the next decade and a half, they were denied the ability to have in-person visits with their loved ones. They could not shake hands with or hug their visitors, and were often disappeared from the public. At various stages of this torturous process, they were subject to psychologist Edgar Schein's methodology of breaking minds. As the name suggests, the Bureau of Prisons used this methodology to dehumanize inmates and make them mentally and emotionally vulnerable to control. In this state, they could be pitted against one another and could be used to achieve the goals of the mercilessly punitive and destructive carceral system. When Keith was eventually tried for the murder of his fellow inmates, the prosecution utilized several unconstitutional and immoral tactics to deny him a fair trial. They violated what is referred to as the Brady precedent, which compels the prosecution to provide all exculpatory evidence to the court. In Keith's case, the exculpatory evidence kept from the court included 3 confessions of other inmates to 3 of the killings, evidence of witness tampering and manipulation consistent with Edgar Schein's aforementioned methodology of breaking men's minds, evidence of several of the inmates having mental illness that would render their testimonies untrustworthy, and the separation of witness statements that supported Keith's innocence from the witnesses who made them, placing an unnecessary and critical interference in the ability for the defense to adequately do their work. In addition, the court chose an all-white jury who had been primed with racialized animosity by our culture to try Keith, who is a black man, for the murders. The court disqualified the 2 black potential jurors out of 50 potential jurors. One of the 2 black potential jurors had stated outright her moral opposition to the death penalty based on her religious objections. They prosecuted Keith for these crimes based on the obviously spurious allegation that Keith was motivated by a desire to support a revolt in which he had no stake. They provided no grounds for this motive, nor any believable narrative of when, how, and why Keith would have committed the murders. Finally, the jury sentenced Keith to death, and his judge, Fred Crow, affirmed this sentence. The prosecution, jury, and judge thus carried out a mockery of justice, to use Keith's phrase. They sentenced him to the most extreme and immoral punishment possible, based on a transparent mistrial. Keith has spent the last 25 years since his sentence in solitary confinement. After Keith broke out of his cell several years later without harming anybody, guards at Ohio State Penitentiary beat him almost to death, rendering him unconscious, leaving him with broken ribs and bruises all over his body. Until he was finally able to replace them in 2015, his attorneys Kate McGarry and David Doughton all but surrendered his case, and all but encouraged him to do the same. In so doing, they were essentially acting as controlled opposition on behalf of the prosecution. From my perspective, 2 primary themes arise from Condemned. First, while the American judicial system is superior to the judicial system of other countries in some respects, it is also largely a tool of the racist plutocracy that controls our economic, political, and cultural circumstances. A plutocracy is a political system that favors the wealthy to the extreme detriment of poor and working people. A racist plutocracy is a plutocracy that also favors one racial group over all others. In the case of the American plutocracy, our judicial and prison system is a tool for wealthy, white people to exploit and dehumanize all poor and working people, while disproportionately harming poor and working people of color. Unlike the wealthy, powerful, mostly white men who participated in the crimes of Jeffrey Epstein and who are currently avoiding accountability, Keith comes from poverty. Though he had some good luck with his first attorneys, ever since his death sentence, when his lawyers were removed from his case without explanation, Keith has not been able to afford legal representation that would adequately prove his innocence and compel his release from prison. In addition, the violence he has suffered from prison guards, most of whom come from poverty or working-class backgrounds, is a tool of the racist plutocracy. If poor and working people are disunified from one another, as I am sure Edgar Schein's methodology of breaking men's minds advises, they can be more easily manipulated to act violently against one another, and thus are more easily exploited. The promotion of racist narratives in our media, education, and political discourse encourages this kind of violence to the detriment of all poor and working people, and to the benefit of the wealthy. Despite this injustice of American plutocracy, however, another crucial theme arises from a thorough reading of Condemned. Keith is not a victim in any ultimate sense of the word. Though he has suffered relentlessly brutal violence, he is also a courageous and compassionate hero. While in prison, Keith has used his love for literature, his great intellect, and his compassion for himself and others to unify with his fellow prisoners, learn profound moral and philosophical lessons from writers and his comrades outside of the prison, and hold out hope for his eventual freedom. In 2011, he and 4 other inmates who were charged for crimes that took place during the Lucasville uprising staged a successful hunger strike for 2 weeks that won them their ability to have in-person visits with their loved ones. Surprisingly, 2 of those 5 men, often referred to as the Lucasville Five, had been part of a white supremacist organization called the Aryan Brotherhood. However, the 5 of them heroically shrugged off Schein's methodology. They found unity in their shared struggle and used nonviolent direct action to compel the prison to give them some of their basic human rights. Keith published his book in 2015. Since then, he has continued to be subject to solitary confinement and other grievous harms. In one of my next letters to you, I will review some of the public information on the use of solitary confinement and the state of prison life in Ohio. Somehow, he has maintained stoic focus and self-respect while undergoing this torture. He has avoided the pits of despair, maintained his connection with his loved ones, and held out hope for the possibility of freedom. Now, I will tell you about how I have been blessed to befriend Keith through several in-person meetings at Ohio State Penitentiary. In a roundabout way, I befriended Keith because we are both musicians. Another example of Keith's moral, creative, and intellectual powers is his participation in the Freedom First Ensemble. The Freedom First Ensemble is a jazz band led by the Brooklyn-based keyboardist and composer Albert Marquez. Albert is both incredibly talented as a musician and is also an ardent advocate for imprisoned people. He uses his beautiful music to advocate for people like Keith all over the world. Whenever he can, he invites them to participate in this process actively. In 2020, Albert heard about Keith through a friend and fellow activist in the movement for carceral justice. He reached out to Keith shortly thereafter to arrange a meeting at the Ohio State Penitentiary. Ever open to new connections, Keith agreed. Albert was so compelled by their meeting and Keith's soul, story, and literary talents that he asked Keith to make music with him. Keith was flabbergasted at first. How could he possibly join a jazz band? He was in solitary confinement for 23 hours per day and had no musical experience whatsoever. Albert proposed to him that they have Keith read his writings over phone calls, while Albert's band would be set up in the studio on the other end, playing softly and simply. Whenever there would be natural pauses in Keith's narration, the band's soloist would improvise for some extended period, and then pass the focus back to Keith's narration. Though Keith was quite unsure about the idea at first, he eventually took the challenge on with diligent focus. Since then, the Freedom First Ensemble has released 2 albums with Keith, a self-entitled album in 2022 and Life from Death Row in 2025, the latter of which was recorded at the independent, non-profit music venue Joe's Pub in Manhattan. You can and should listen to both albums on Spotify, as they are both marvelous works of art. Keith's reading showcases his compassion, spiritual strength, and intellectual rigor, the immense suffering he has been subjected to by the state of Ohio notwithstanding. Albert and his band masterfully advance the language of Keith's heart through their rapturously beautiful accompaniment, which recalls the seminal work of John Coltrane's album Love Supreme. While I hope they might have some reach into your own heart, my writings cannot faintly approximate the power of this music. Please listen to it to awaken your heart, your mercy, your moral courage. As I have said above, I am also a musician and have come to know Keith through music. In June of 2023, I had been working with a bass player that had played with Keith's bandmate, Albert, in improvisational ensembles in support of the George Floyd protests. This former collaborator of mine told me about Keith and put me in touch with Amy Gordejev, Keith's dear friend and primary advocate outside of prison. After an hour-long conversation with her about Keith, I felt a great urge to help him as I could. I pledged a financial grant to help fund a documentary film that would help tell his story to the public. She then introduced me to Keith over a brief phone conversation. In fact, if you search The Injustice of Justice, Keith LaMar, on YouTube, you'll be able to watch the beautiful short film that would eventually be produced from this meeting. The film is narrated by Keith and scored by the Freedom First Ensemble. It includes the artwork of the talented Molly Crabapple. It is a moving account of the events described in Keith's book Condemned, and a statement of Keith's determination to be freed from his wrongful death sentence. I have met with Keith 5 times in total at the Ohio State Penitentiary, where he is still incarcerated. My experience with Keith aligns exactly with that of anthropology professor Dennis O'Hearn, who was a friend of Keith while he was still alive and wrote the foreword of Condemned. As Dennis says in his foreword, Keith is one of the most engaging men you will ever talk to. Though Keith spends 22 to 23 hours a day in a cell that is 108 square feet. Excuse me. Though he spends 22 to 23 hours a day in a cell that is 100 square feet, I have felt this total engagement firsthand. Keith is a master conversationalist, both taking initiative and telling his story actively and honestly, while leaving space for me to talk about my own life, answer his questions about it, or ask my own questions about his life. A jazz metaphor is appropriate here.
When you talk to Keith, you are truly trading fours. This is a phrase that describes the jazz convention wherein two players take turns trading four-bar phrases. Big pause there. Had a frog in my throat. All right. Let us continue, Governor. A jazz metaphor is appropriate here. When you talk to Keith, you are truly trading fours. This is a phrase that describes the jazz convention, wherein two players take turns improvising four-bar phrases. The goal of trading fours is to express oneself as beautifully and authentically as one can, while also responding to and encouraging the other player toward the same end. When two players are really trading fours, the sense of them taking solos falls away altogether. The audience sees and enjoys a true conversation between two souls through music, arguably the most universal human language. Again, Keith does not see himself as a capital V victim, nor does he see all other people as brutal oppressors. He cares genuinely about the people that meet with him. The manager of my rock band, Beth Narducci, who has herself joined the cause for Keith's freedom, has joined me for all of my visits. Keith wants to know about our lives, desires, challenges, enjoyments, virtues, foibles, and mediocrities. I have never felt for a moment that he wants to make me feel guilty for not being in prison, for being economically comfortable, or for being a white man. He sees me and Beth as he sees himself. Even though we are separated by bulletproof glass or seated at a table together while one of us is chained to the floor, we are just three people talking with each other, after all. He laughs fully and heartily at our jokes and the funny stories we tell him about our lives, empathizes with our everyday struggles, and hopes for us to have all of the successes we can in this life. On the second of my 2-day visits, we are allowed to meet in person instead of separated by a pane of glass, and we are able to have physical contact. As I had described to you in my last letter, we are able to do so because of the successful hunger strike Keith and several of his fellow inmates performed in January of 2011. When we say hello and goodbye to each other, we say, "I love you," and we hug as family members do. Before I leave the meeting hall, I try to be as strong as he is, as I look over my shoulder, to see him smiling beautifully and waving goodbye to me. I am about to meet with him again, in fact, next week. I will go with Beth again for 2 of the days, but for the first time, I will bring my father with me for the last of the 3 visits. My father, who, by the way, grew up in the very small town of Akron, Ohio, also connected deeply with Keith's story when we read Condemned together in our book club. My father is only a year older than you, Governor Dewine. This feels like a poignant coincidence. You are both men who grew up in small communities in Ohio. You and my father might as well have been friends growing up. You seem to aspire to maintain a congenial, almost fatherly public image. I hope that impression I have is rooted in a capacity you have for real human empathy. I will tell you about our next meeting with Keith in my next letter to you. I expect that my father will share this sense of moral urgency for Keith's cause after our meeting, and I hope I can summon your moral urgency as well. Keith had been sentenced to die shortly after I met him in July of 2023. However, you gave him a reprieve. The new date of his execution, as I said in the first paragraph, is January 13th, 2027, a mere 48 weeks from now. You cited a lack of ability to find intravenous drugs to perform this execution. However, both supporters of the death penalty and its opponents can sense that this is not the real reason for your reprieve. We can sense that your heart is not in it. From the supporters of death penalty perspective, you are a coward. They probably use all kinds of misogynistic slurs to denigrate you based on some ridiculous belief that real men are strong. In other words, they're willing to use violence to punish people. This idea of strength through violence, especially the violence of the execution of death row inmates, however, is bitterly absurd. It requires very little strength to inject a needle into a fully restrained person's body or to turn on the switch of an electric chair. It requires even less strength to look the other way while another man does this deed. I think you know better, Governor Dewine. You have stated that you were opposed to the use of the death penalty. An article published on December 15th, 2025 on cleveland.com states that you are morally opposed to this practice and that you would make a public statement to this effect in January of 2026. But January has passed and we are eagerly still awaiting your statement. Stand tall in the strength of your moral convictions, Governor. Redeem the brutal, bigoted, and exploitative violence that has bedeviled our history and ruined so many lives. Be a man who is strong enough to practice mercy and afford people with their basic human rights. Do the right thing, Governor. Set Keith LaMar free. Sincerely, David Roush. I might as well take this opportunity as I fold this letter and put it in the envelope to say that there might be an ASMR element to some of these letters, which is the snoring of my beloved doggie who likes to sit next to me sometimes and sleep. I wonder if you have a beloved doggie, Governor Dewine. I imagine you have loved ones. I hope that you operate from a place of real love and compassion in your work, as you're supposed to be a public servant. To truly serve the public, you should embody true love, which implies mercy and true justice, which implies nonviolence. Do the right thing, Governor. Set Keith LaMar free.